All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. This is kind of a long question. Ian writes, although there is a danger in simplifying things, you mentioned the variability in things. Perhaps the ideolog, logicians, is missing out on additional key components that are found in other areas such as in art, music, comedy, or poetry. The director of the movie The Incredibles, Brad Bird, discusses how animation is great at caricature, which reduces something down to its essence. It's about intensifying whatever the essence of that thing is, and the drawing of that person would look more like the person than the person did. How is that? They took what was distinctive about the person or event and emphasized it, and took away the things that didn't emphasize it, so it is boiled down to its essence. Animators not only do this with the style of how something looks, but also how it moves. Is there no place to include them in the discussion of philosophy, because they too are only scratching the surface of existence? There's so many good words in here. This is a phenomenal question. That's a pun. We'll get to that. So there's two ways of looking at this question. This question about caricatures. When we see Dilbert, or when we see Mr. Incredible, or when we see any an emphasized type. We've reviewed a couple of videos. I know you read my message would be a type that we're maybe exaggerating and caricaturing. Is that capturing an essence of a thing? Let's take it to a place that's a little bit more intense. How about racial stereotypes? Do racial stereotypes or gender stereotypes get to the essence of a kind of person? Or is it somehow incomplete? And there's two ways of, like I said, of approaching this question, and the language of Ian's question already brings us into the first approach. And that's the classical philosophical dichotomy of how we might approach this question. That is we can look at it as a question of essence and existence. Does a thing even have an essence? Or, as the existentialists would say, does existence precede essence? Now, a little background on these two things. Essentialism comes from Plato, really. Now, I happen to believe that Plato was probably not an essentialist, but Neoplatonists are. Neoplatonists believe that Plato argued for that and didn't just present it as an argument. And it believes that there's a certain core or an idea or form or essence, we might say, at the heart of an entity. Because this is not just about people; it's about rocks, chairs. You go back, read the Republic. There's an ideal form of like a chair or a table, that like all variations of the form of a table, like a chair I might be sitting in, are imitations or images of the form or idea of chair. The perfect chair is just an idea. That's the essence of a chair. And so when we look at a caricature, a simplifying down of a chair, maybe we're getting at its essence. Now, this was a classical way of viewing things and thinking about the metaphysics of things until the 19th, really the 20th century. Some would say Soren Kierkegaard was kind of a proto-existentialist. Sartre tried to claim that Heidegger was a proto-existentialist. You might even put Nietzsche kind of in that category of existentialists. But it really begins with Sartre, and the French existentialists generally. most of them were communists, but not all of them. A distinctive exception would be Albert Camus, excellent French existentialist and also anti-communist, which is nice for a change. Although he would call himself an absurdist, but that's just a subgenre of existentialism. Existentialism, like existentialists, like I said before, believe that existence precedes essence, which is to say, things are before they have distinctive natures, which were sort of, as I was bringing up in a previous video, you might have caught me talking about essentialism versus nominalism. Essentialism believes that categories are real. Nominalism holds that categories are things that we ascribe to entities. They arrive post hoc. There's a connection here. Existentialism is closely related to, and in some cases might be identical with, nominalism. Existentialism holds that we are free. We don't have actually any obligations. And Sartre said, if you truly understand this, it's not a liberating experience. It's actually almost dizzying or nauseating. One of his main books was called Nausea. When you truly understand the freedom you have, it's actually terrifying. It's like, I can literally do anything. And there's a kind of responsibility that comes with this freedom. First of all, to maintain your freedom, but to act in a way that's decent to, other people. What would essentialism versus existentialism, how would those relate to caricatures? Well, if you're an essentialist, there would be a right way and a wrong way to do caricatures. Like, you wouldn't want a caricature to be capturing the wrong essential feature. Like, if you think that the core, the essential feature of a table is that it has 4 legs, you might run into problems. You might caricature a table by creating something really, really, really small because it's funny or something, and people mistake it for a nightstand instead of a table. Or, maybe you give it a sloped surface or a ball, a sphere on top. It's got 4 legs, so it's still a table, right? No. And this is where you get into funny arguments about, like, is a hot dog technically a taco because of the way the bread wraps? Reddit has all these kinds of funny discussions of people pretending to take essentialism too seriously. It's all people trying their hand at being Diogenes with Plato's man, the plucked chicken. But this begs a kind of interest. So how does this play out with caricatures? There might be a risk of doing caricatures wrong if you're an essentialist, but if you do it right, then you are capturing the essence of a thing. And as the question posits, perhaps if you can capture the essence of a thing, maybe your depiction of the thing, your image of the thing, is more real than the thing itself. And this will send Neoplatonists into a head-clutching spiral of like, no, images are the opposites of forms. Forms are more real, and then there's the thing, and then images are the worst. And what's the difference between a form and an image? Tricky question, actually. But what if you're an existentialist? What if you believe that existence precedes essence, and you look at a caricature of a thing, something where there's a distinctive feature about a person or an object, and the image exaggerates that feature? As an existentialist, you might look at this as problematic. You're actually misleading people, because this thing is not just the exaggerated feature. And in fact, when it comes to other people, you might not just be doing something problematic at a perceptual level. You might be doing something morally problematic by priming people to see this person as only that distinctive feature. And maybe that's a bad distinctive feature, right? And this is what broadly gets called racism or sexism, right? We are existentialists looking at exaggerated generalizations and saying this is not just wrong, but it's misleading, and it's priming people into a confirmation bias, and it's creating an unfair essence for the person at our level of perception where there actually is no essence. There is no necessary essence, we might say. You are incarcerating them with this image, we might even say. So from an existentialist perspective, caricature is not just misleading at the level of perception, but maybe even wrong. There is a question of like, how would we know even if a person has an essence? Maybe they do. Because existentialism, while it flips, existence and essence, it doesn't necessarily say that there is no such thing as an essence. And I think the essentialist might counter argue, well, how do you explain genetics? If you look at a caterpillar, just a caterpillar by itself, it has a destiny, right? Which is a trajectory of the things it's supposed to do. It's supposed to eat enough, and then it's supposed to form a cocoon, and then it's supposed to become a butterfly. Now, it might not do that. It might get eaten before, or it might decide to read Camus and go off on vacation in France instead and never become a butterfly. It's entirely free to do that, but it was built for that purpose, right? It's in a biological genetic pattern that it was built according to plans that it would do this thing. And this is where we run into someone like Heidegger, who Sartre tried to claim for the existentialists, but Heidegger rejected the existentialist label. He said, we don't even know enough about being to understand how essence and existence are different from each other, if they are, or what those two things are respectively. He didn't think we were in a knowledge place to even really meaningfully and honestly and legitimately participate in a serious discussion about essence and existence, although he did think it was an important question. He said, we need to step back before we can have that discussion, and we need to figure out being in the first place. And that begins with our own experience as beings. In other words, it begins with perception. And this leads us to maybe an alternative framing. Maybe we don't look at the question of caricatures and how is it that these caricatures seem to be conveying something more meaningful than a like realistic depiction. What if instead of looking at it through the lens of metaphysics, what if we look at it instead through the lens of perception? And here we run into a different dichotomy. We can look at what Kant called the noumena on one hand, which is the thing itself, the thing as it actually exists in the world, not essence or existence, but the totality of what it is actually, versus the phenomena. And the phenomena, these are both Greek terms, of course. The phenomena comes from the Greek phynos, which means appearance or image, sometimes with the connotation of shining, but that's not relevant here. So instead of looking, so we can talk all day about the noumena, and Kant's whole, the reason he got into philosophy in the first place was an attempt to salvage the possibility of true knowledge from the skepticism of David Hume. And he did this by putting the possibility of certainty outside of and apart from experience, prior to experience, he called it, a priori. So in the realm of pure forms, so to speak. That's just Neoplatonism, kind of in another way. It's not. It's different, but similar metaphysically. So that there is maybe the possibility of accessing the noumena, at least at the level of ideas. This is where I mentioned in the previous video Descartes' ontological argument for the triangle. That's the noumena. That's the things as they are, but kind of only in the realm of ideas. We're not talking about physical matter. We're not talking about actual objects. What if we're concerned about that? What if we're talking about people? What if we're talking about chairs or tables or things? And this is where Heidegger comes in. He says, "What if?" Actually, it's really Husserl. Husserl did the heavy lifting, and then Heidegger comes in and sort of really develops it and brings Husserl's extraordinary volume of writing and thought into arguably a more accessible manner to the broader public. But he says, what if, given the inaccessibility of the noumena to us, which Kant grants, by the way, and he basically grants that David Hume is correct, and the limitations of our power of perception to access things as they actually are, to know with any kind of certainty what is in the world physically. Which is not to say that an external world doesn't exist, we just can't know it. We still have our senses. We still have the phenomena, the way things appear to us. And I think that the best way to look at this is, or the best way to move from this back to caricatures, is by way of art and the art world. And I'm thinking in particular of Impressionism. So if you look at like a Monet painting, he's not painting what is exactly. This is like the brilliance of Monet. He's painting things as they strike the eye. And he's exactly as Ian described in relation to characters. He's somehow capturing something about how our perception processes these things that is not the thing itself. It's like a magic trick in causing our brain to fill in the gaps a little bit, but it's capturing what's filled in, which is an extraordinarily introspective thing to do. It's an accomplishment of introspection to be able to see that this impression is what we are actually seeing, and then to depict that impression. It's an extraordinary thing. Actually, impression is a pretty good translation of phenomena. A side note. And another great example of this in art, outside of Impressionism and into the world of fantasy, is Frank Frazetta. If you ever look at Frank Frazetta's fantasy models, and you can go as PG or non-PG really as you want with these, but what you'll notice is that many of Frank Frazetta's paintings kind of lose focus around the edges. They look kind of unfinished around the outside. There is detail in a central focal point, and it's not that he said good enough. No, he left those parts less detailed intentionally, because if you are looking around at the world, your eyes can actually only focus on one point at a time, right? Your brain is filling in the gaps based on your eyes are constantly doing this number, and they're constantly getting more information, and your brain's short-term memory is holding that information in place and filling in the gaps in real time to generate an image of what's around you. But that's not actually what you're seeing, and your subconscious brain sort of knows that. So if you ever look at a painting where all the details are filled in and everything is equally detailed, for some reason, it might strike you as not quite realistic, or some reason. The focus is too broad. It doesn't match what we're actually seeing when we look at a real thing in real life. Even though when we think about it too hard, it feels like we're seeing everything in detail at the same time. So Frank Frazetta's focus, and he's not the only one who does this. He's not the pioneer who did this. He's just the first example I could think of offhand, and he's a fairly well-known painter, who conveys the human experience of the object rather than the object itself. We're doing phenomenology with art, essentially, with impressionism and with focus. And so what we have with caricatures is basically the same principle. Caricatures convey not the essence of a thing or its totality of existence, obviously, but they do capture, caricatures, the things our eyes move to first. And it captures what distinguishes a thing from other similar things in that case. So, it conveys what we see. It's a form of impressionism, we might say. So, aren't we concerned about what is? Don't we want our art? Why is it that, Mr. Bird's Incredibles or I don't know, Hayao Miyazaki films? I'll save him for later, actually. Forget I brought that up. Any of these other comics that exaggerate the physicalities of certain characters, or, cartoons. I brought up Dilbert before. He's far from the only one who does this. Aren't we concerned that they will mislead us in some way? Well, maybe. We don't want to, expose ourselves to that too repeatedly, perhaps. There might be some truth to the existentialist concern about programming us into mistaking the appearance for the more complex existential reality of an entity. But, isn't it a little presumptuous to think that A, that's certainly what the effect's going to be, or B, that maybe, that some things might not matter more than others, and that what we actually perceive, how our perception works, is valid as a mode of depicting an entity. And isn't there something anti-human, or at least anti-perception, in the existentialist presupposition about the problematic nature of these depictions? So maybe it's more honest to simply start with what we can perceive and with how we perceive, and acknowledging that, even if it isn't entirely correct. Maybe we begin with phenomenology. Maybe we begin with the appearances of things and the distinctive qualities of things, and move forward from there and have that be a starting point, and then from there we can have conversations about the more complex nature of things. And by the way, this actually works at the level of perception. So for example, we'll go back to the somewhat edgy example. What about racial stereotypes? It might be tempting to lean into certain visual cues about racial groups and depict certain races with large facial features. The types. I don't need to go into it. But what happens if you're a comic artist and you're dealing with two people of the same race? Well, crap. How do you distinguish those? You have to get a little bit more nuanced. You have to get a little. Turns out, two people of the same ethnicity, if you're trying to depict them together, you can't rely on one set of racial stereotypes to distinguish them. And so it actually works out, and it turns out we actually can distinguish between individuals of the same race. Well, look at that. We can distinguish between individuals of the same sex and gender. It's not hard. And we all know this. And when you actually look at comics, because especially political cartoons, which are the most aggressive in their caricaturing, they do often lean into racial stereotyping, whether we like to or not. But those racial stereotypes, first of all, they're universal. It captures basically everybody. There's a way to caricature white guys. There's a way to caricature black women in our proportions and heads and stuff. And there's ways to use that to distinguish individual white men from other white men, or individual black women from other black women. The principle applies in a nested manner all the way down. Suddenly, human beings themselves are caricatures. Is that evil or unfair? Maybe they're just trying to quickly convey human, and the exaggeration taps into the distinctive visual cues that cause us to identify human. For example, you might notice that human caricatures almost always have massive heads, like heads that are way larger than is proportional, obviously. Now, let's jump over a little bit into the world of military application. You might have heard that military units, not just snipers, but even regular, infantry and light infantry, will often use outline distortion to break up their silhouette in an extreme form. This looks like a ghillie suit. You might see like viper hoods that it's just a little bit of like plant foliage strapped to their helmet, World War II style. Or they might have like a viper hood for a DM or some guy out in the field or whatever. That's to break up the outline, because that head and shoulders pattern is really distinctive of humans. That's what makes us visually separate from bears, mountain lions, deer, skunks, whatever. It distinguishes us from basically everything else, unless you're in Africa and you're looking at, there's like chimps and gorillas and other hominids, or hominoids, I should say, with, kind of similar silhouettes, but even they're different, So, wow, look at that. Caricatures have naturally homed in on things that are built into our powers of perception, and we can prove it by military camouflaging techniques. So, maybe, like, these characters, like, if you were to judge these caricatures morally, Are you also morally judging just our natural, how we perceive things in the world? Some would say, yes, that's wrong. It's incomplete. It's inaccurate. It's like, well, that might be true that it's not complete and not accurate, but you're probably giving up a lot more functionality by rejecting those heuristic cues and clues than you are gaining in functionality. You're giving up a lot in speed and even accuracy in the name of like precision and completion that you're never going to get anyways. So I think, let's return to the question. Like, does, how do you phrase this? How is that? How is it that they can convey more like a truer essence of the person than even the person itself? So, if we accept the perception frame of noumena versus phenomena rather than existence versus essence, then maybe a caricature doesn't convey a subject's essence. Rather, maybe it conveys the perceptive cues that identify a thing as itself to us, the viewer. Now, if you come up with an idea of the concept of a thing based on your experience of it, then those perceptive cues will feel identical to its essence, because that's the commonality. That's the core. That's the universal as it applies to this thing. So calling these visual perceptive cues of distinctness the essence is actually circular. It actually it's circular. It's calling the thing that you've always identified it by the essence, but that was the thing you were looking for. Like that, a true hunt for the essence of a thing would have to be getting down below the surface, presumably. But our thought works more by association, and we associate the visual cues with whatever we discover about its deeper meanings and inner workings anyways. So, but that circularity doesn't make talking about the essence of a thing any less meaningful when we're speaking colloquially, when we're not talking in philosophically precise manner. For example, when we're listening to Brad Bird talk about why he designed the Incredibles characters the way he did. When you look at Mr. Incredible, just his outline just screams strength. Just his form tells you everything you need to know that this guy is strong. And that's exactly what he is, So we get what Brad Bird is saying when he's talking about this, getting to the essence of a thing. And we don't need to take that in a metaphysical way. We can understand that he's a film director talking about the viewer experience and what this character means as a literary device sometimes, but also like what we associate with them and how we distinguish them from other characters. So with this approach of perception rather than metaphysics as our starting point for understanding why do characters hit us the way they do, I think we have a better we end up with a better relationship with caricatures. We end up in a place where we understand that a caricature isn't a complete representation of the thing, and we're not bothered by that because we know that's what it is. Of course it's incomplete. And it's not morally problematic. But I think at a deeper level, beginning with perception, as Heidegger does, instead of, for example, Kant or Plato, leads to a much humbler philosophy. It tends to fewer grand proclamations about what we can know with certainty or about the universe or whatever. It's much smaller scale in its claims and in its understandings of things. But despite this smaller scale of what we think we can explain when we begin with perception, you don't end up any less curious or introspective or circumspect in your approach to things or in your appreciation of life and existence. And in fact, I think it might even increase those things: curiosity, introspection, and circumspection. Because it won't, beginning with perception and understanding the limitations of perception will never take you to a place where you imagine you know anything with certainty that you don't. Certainty is the place where curiosity and introspection and circumspection go to die. And it's really the end of philosophy. So, I think if we begin with a more phenomenological approach, not just to appreciating, art or comics or film, but life more generally. If we begin with a phenomenological approach rather than a noumenal approach, rather than an essentialist or an existentialist approach, because those are two sides of the same coin, really. They claim to know how things really are in the world. It not only leads to a humbler place, but it leads to a world or experience of the world where we can appreciate things more enjoyably. Like we don't get caught up with in the wrongness of the depictions or the things. Because remember, an essentialist might criticize a caricature as wrong as well. It allows us to enjoy these things and to recognize what crosses over with our actual perceptions, what it captures in our perception, what it doesn't. And it doesn't mean we can't get things wrong. If someone draws a picture and there's shadow on one side of one object, but on the other side of the other object, you're like, you didn't get your light focus right. And that's fine. Sometimes things are just wrong, and that's okay. And our perception can tell us these things too. So we're not totally in a relativistic, dark room where everybody's truth is equally valid or anything, just because we're beginning with perception. But it does take us back from the kind of certainty that causes us to find certain kinds of caricatures or certain kinds of comedy or stuff problematic. It sticks us back solidly in our own experience of the world, and which actually situates us in the world, rather than looking down on the world as if from outside, like an essentialist, or as a romantic wayfarer in this absurd universe, like an existentialist. It's like, no, you're in it. You're here. You're a part of it. Participate in it to the best of your ability. And I mentioned Hayao Miyazaki before because I think Hayao Miyazaki is really, arguably, the best spiritual depiction of what the worldview of Heidegger might look like in action, from the technology that we see in Princess Mononoke to the participation and maturation that we see in Spirited Away, and all that stuff. It's very Heideggerian, and the caricatures that we see, Yubaba is a caricature, a very good one too, and by no means the only one. So we can, we can allow ourselves to appreciate the characters and what they might tell us, and the fact that they match our perceptions, without trusting them completely, but recognizing that to reject them outright would involve rejecting our senses too, and perhaps rejecting ourselves as subjective beings in this world as somehow problematic or morally problematic, which is no way to live, and which we don't have the epistemic foundation to make that kind of moralistic proclamation anyways. So anyways, I hope that didn't leave any of you too far in the weeds. I hope it answered the question about whether there's a place in the discussion of philosophy for caricatures and these kinds of simplifications. I think the answer is yes, with a dozen or so asterisks, but that's just part and parcel of the field. So hope you enjoyed. Thanks so much for listening, and take care.